This podcast is brought to you by Amusement Warehouse Magazine, the industry's largest trade publication. We cover amusement parks, carnivals, fairs, festivals, history, safety columns. We really got it all when it comes to the amusement business. Only remaining print publication in the amusement industry on a regular basis. So if you're interested in what the amusement industry has to offer, subscribe today. You can subscribe by logging on to amusementwarehouse.com, carnivalwarehouse.com, or amusementparkwarehouse.com. And welcome to another edition of the Amusement Warehouse podcast. We've got a full of information and history today with Doc Rivera, who is a curator of the International Independent Show Museum, also known as the Carnival Museum. Doc, welcome.
Thank you.
We got through all the technical difficulties. We're in good shape now, I think. You're coming in loud and clear. Just don't touch anything. We'll be good.
No.
So, doctors, you also do a column for us at Amusement Warehouse, which I enjoy reading every month. So it's always you're full of knowledge. How did you get so much knowledge? That's what I've been thinking about. I've been meaning to ask you. How do you know so much about the history of the carnival?
Well, it's just it started out as a hobby many years ago, and it just spiraled into this.
And to know, I mean, did you read a lot of the books that were written at the time, or how do you?
Yes, at the time. Pardon me. I read, of course, McKinnon's book, The History of the Carnival, and as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the best books ever written. It'll last forever. And once I read that, I was hooked. I wanted to know more.
I think you just hit something that turned your videos.
I didn't hit it. I promise you.
Okay. Well, you're a little green right now. McKinnon's book is great, and all the ones that were written that go over the individual carnivals too are really really interesting as well. That I've read some of those. It's interesting how people took that up as a hobby to kind of chronicle the history of the carnival and all the things that go on.
There's so much history in the billboard magazines, the earlier billboards, and it's a wonderful thing. If you can get your hands on a few copies of those, you can really enlighten and educate yourself.
Absolutely. So, headed back to the beginning, how did carnivals get started? What got everybody started with the rides and where we're going today?
It kind of took off in stages. Most people credit the Columbian World's Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair, with the onset of the carnival business. But there were carnivals around. They just weren't organized carnivals. There was people that owned, say, wooden Ferris wheels and what we call back end shows. And they were just laying them down any place they could. But with the advent of the Columbian World's Exposition, everybody came together for that 6 months. And that kind of showed them what an organized carnival could do.
I got you. So it was like, sort of like one attraction, like you'd see at a, like a coin op attraction. You go at a store or something like that to just set up somewhere and be one piece, and that'd be it. Maybe with a food stand or something like that too.
It might be an old nailed together hamburger stand or a nailed together beer stand, or but. When the Columbian World's Exposition happened in 1893, they gave it a better look, and everything was organized. They had organized opening hours, closing hours, and people were able to exchange ideas. And so that was really, the concept of the carnival business got started, a year or two after the Columbian World's Exposition. But it gave everybody a taste of how an organized carnival could be operated. Probably the one of the best things that ever came out of there that affected the carnival business was that back end show Little Egypt. Everybody's heard of Little Egypt? I'm sure. Have you heard of Little Egypt?
Actually, I haven't.
Well, Little Egypt, she walks, she talks, she crawls on her belly like a reptile. Little Egypt was a dancer that did the belly dance. And she wasn't even from Egypt. She was from Syria. And she was the wife of a Greek local restaurateur there in Chicago. And she did the belly dance. It was scandalous at the time. You got to remember, this is Victorian times.
Mm-hmm.
Several of the women organized, rallied against her, and they contacted the local Chicago paper and lodged their complaints, which everybody just loved because advertising in any form.
Right.
And actually, the show was put on by a promoter named Saul Bloom. And when the fair was over, every carnival in America carried some type of Little Egypt show.
Huh.
There was a Little Egypt, a takeoff of Little Egypt. It might be the Oriental dancers. It could be any name, but that was the precept. That started the girl shows. And of course, the girl shows have always been the premier show on every midway. Of course, there are no shows today, but at the time, no matter how many shows were on the midway, the girl show was always considered to be the premier of all the shows.
So when it started, it was less rides, more shows, basically.
It was really no rides. Rides hadn't been invented yet. Rides didn't come around till the 1920s. There was always a merry-go-round, a carousel,
right,
and a Ferris wheel, because at the Columbian World's Exposition, George Washington Gale Ferris put this huge 246 foot high Ferris wheel up, and it could operate. It carried 2,000, a little over 2,000 passengers at once, in one ride. And he's also credited with inventing the Ferris wheel, but he didn't invent it. There were Ferris wheels around in some form many years before he debuted with his. His was admittedly the biggest, though.
Yeah, that's a tall wheel, especially for back then. Yeah. And that had to go up piece by piece, I guess. That must have been some project.
It took almost 2 years to build it.
Wow.
And Ferris wasn't a ride builder. He was a bridge builder. But he had been contacted by the Chicago World's Fair a few years prior to the Chicago World's Fair. Paris had their World's Fair. And in their World's Fair, they had erected the Eiffel Tower. And Chicago wanted to do something really spectacular, something even bigger than the Eiffel Tower. And they put out, a call for all these ideas. And a lot of ideas came in. One of the ideas was a 100-foot Skyliner that ran from Chicago to New York.
What?
Imagine that.
No, I can't.
No, and they couldn't either. Some of these ideas were really crackpot ideas. But they adopted George Ferris's idea for the Ferris wheel, and that's the rest is history.
Yeah, it's funny how similar, because I had Phil Vavona on our podcast, and they got started famously from the 1949 World's or 39 World's Fair, where they bought the Ferris wheel, and they got started that way. So I guess it's similar from from the Columbia Exposition there, springing from Carnival. So I guess it continued to do so even into the modern era, sort of.
Well, you couldn't take a 241-foot high, 4,000-ton Ferris wheel on the road.
No,
and so a lot of people began being interested in the portability of rides and how they could be operated on the Carnival Midway. And, Eli Bridge is just one.
Yep.
Mr. Sullivan created the Eli Bridge number 5 wheel. And, of course, Condorman invented a wheel. You see a lot of pictures of the Condorman wheel, and it's unique. Condorman only made Ferris wheels from about 1900 to 1910, and then his factory burned down, and so he never made another Ferris wheel. But don't feel too badly for him. He went to Chicago and became a successful real estate developer and made plenty of money. But the first commercial Ferris wheels were Condorman wheels, and they stood 45 feet high, and they were a great wheel. In fact, we have in the museum a Condorman wheel, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the only surviving Condorman wheel in the world.
No way.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I've seen it because I've been over there many times. That's really interesting. So you had the girl shows, the Little Egypt shows. When did the athletic shows, the at shows start? When did they become popular?
Probably 1910. There were a few around, but 1910, most of these shows took off in that era because there were people trying to organize the carnival business. Otto Schmidt, I'm sure you've never heard the name. He wasn't a showman. He was involved in theaters, and he had the great idea of organizing these carnivals and taking them on the road. And so he borrowed $35,000 from a friend of his and put this traveling carnival together. Unfortunately, had no idea what he was doing, and the show only played 3 spots, and then it folded.
Mm.
They at the time, the carnival business, they were not loading anything in wagons. They were just throwing it on the flat cars. In fact, the first jump that the train ever made, they had to stop about 6 times and pick stuff up alongside the track.
Oh, jeez.
It blew off the flat cars. But he wasn't successful. Probably the first successful carnival company was the Canton Carnival Company, and it failed at first, but it failed due to more or less weather and things like that. When it reorganized and started the next year, they made a great success out of it, and so the show started out in Ohio, and it played until September. Started out with one beat up old baggage car, and when they came in September, they had a whole train. Everything had been paid for. It was really the start of the carnival business, the Canton Carnival Company.
And what year was that, Doc?
I'm going to tell you, I don't have everything in front of me, but around 1902.
Okay, so it's still pre-ride times.
Right. There were really no rides. The first ride, I think, that came along that was commercially successful was the Whip.
Whip, right? Yep.
And I am still trying to trace down the initial date. Some people say 1914. Some people say 1904. I tend to believe it was 1914. The Whip became a commercially viable ride, but they had all different kinds of of unique, one of a kind rides, and they just never were commercially successful.
It's funny because we talk about you talk about these early things as carnivals, and then later on, when the rides became more the premier attraction, it changed. But back then, I guess it wasn't geared towards kids as much. Is that fair to say?
It was geared towards families. Uh, you know, uh, one of the big things that was an attraction on an old carnival was the trained animal shows,
Okay.
and there were two or three of these trained animal shows. Uh, I wish I had all my stuff with me. Uh, they were unique because most of these successful trained animal shows immigrated from Europe. They came over here. Most of them came over on an old tramp steamer that landed in Coney Island, and they were really instrumental in organizing the carnival. Uh, they organized the way that a carnival's loaded on a train.
Mm.
But it wasn't the circuses that did that. It was some folks from Europe.
That's interesting. So from 1900 or so to 1920, before the rides became popular, most of these shows were, or most of these, when I say shows, I mean carnivals, were made up of what? Of mostly shows and maybe some food stands, or what did a
It was
typical carnival look like?
mostly shows. They'd have a Ferris wheel and a merry-go-round, and the rest would be back-end shows. And they were very unique shows. They just about anything you can imagine, enterprising carnival men made a show out of. Uh, not just the girl shows, or pardon me, the ad shows. There were, like I say, the trained animal shows, just everything you can think of.
So in that show, they were wrestling what? Mostly bears would wrestle a person.
No. They take on all comers. They wrestlers and boxers.
Wrestlers and boxers. Oh, just take on anybody from the audience.
Yep, anybody. And they, the carnival business was the time that we're talking about was really the wild, wild west of carnival business. They did anything they could think of, and there was nothing off limits. And, they had, for instance, the 49er camps. And those were shows. They were made to emulate the scenarios of the 49er California 49er gold rush camps. But then they graduated into something that was, they had open bars that served whiskey, and they had young ladies that started out just dancers, 10 cents a dance. Then later on, they were prostitutes. They have a big old hay bale behind the tent, and they wrestle their customers. They got to be so bad and so rough that there were gunfights out in front of not stage gunfights like you'd see in Disney World, actual gunfights and stabbings and everything. And so it was the carnival industry themselves that shut the 49er camps down, because they were getting so bad that a carnival just couldn't play the same town twice. They had a carnival that carried the 49er camp got the reputation as just being a slash and bang carnival, and they didn't want them around anymore. So the carnival industry themselves got rid of the 49er camps. But there were a lot of other shows that, now those aren't to be confused with a Wild West show. A lot of carnivals carried a small Wild West show, and they were great. They were just what you would imagine a Wild West show to be. And there were, for instance, Hawaiian shows. You got to remember now, it's the turn of the 20th century, and Hawaii might as well be Mars for most people, because most people were. This was an agrarian society, all farms and rural areas at this time. The big industrial revolution was taking place in the cities, and it was mostly immigrant labor. The people of America lived in these small towns, and they had maybe read about Hawaii, but they'd never seen it. So when a show came to town, had a Hawaiian show, that was a big thing. Of course, they advertised the girls as they'd have 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5 Hawaiian dancers out there in grass skirts doing the hula, and people didn't really know. They were amazed by this. Most of the girls weren't Hawaiian; they were from Keokuk, Iowa, or someplace, and but they played the Hawaiian guitar and danced the hula, and just did a fire dance, with the fire sticks and all that kind of. But it was an amazing thing. You got to remember, these weren't sophisticated audiences like we have today. They weren't as educated. They didn't have computers and iPhones and any of that kind of stuff. If they had a magic show, most magic shows today, we go, kids' birthday parties. But in those days, magic was a big thing. They were just amazed by the simplest of magic tricks.
Mm. And the way they were set up, though, business-wise, would the carnival own all the shows, and would you pay by the show, or how did it work?
Well, the carnivals didn't own the shows. They might own one, but mostly they were all independent.
Okay.
The carnival owned the rides, and the carnival, and this is important, owned the generator, which really wasn't a generator as we might conceive of one today. It was a steam dynamo. All the rides were run by steam, and the dynamo was run by steam. And so you can imagine this big wagon loaded piece of equipment stood probably 6-7 feet, and it produced all the electricity for the show, for the carnival, and it probably only produced 40-45 kilowatts of electricity. It's a huge thing, but it was an amazing thing. The carnivals had electricity when most small towns didn't.
Mm.
And so that brought people out to see
that in itself. Yeah.
Now, the independent shows usually didn't have any contract with the carnival to provide them with any electricity. First of all, the dynamo wasn't big enough to produce electricity for everybody, and they had what is called pan lamps, or a banjo lamp. So they were, all the concessions and all the shows were responsible for their own lighting, and most of that was most of that was kerosene, pan lamps and things like that.
So would you pay? You wouldn't pay an admission to get in. You would pay by each attraction. Is that how it worked?
Yeah, pretty much. That's the way it worked up to the 1960s.
Yeah, without a central ticketing system.
Yeah, and then they went to pay one price, and it got to the point where the carnival owned almost everything that was worth owning,
mm-hmm.
in one form or another. And if the carnival didn't actually own outright those things that made money, then they were owned by members of the carnival owner's family.
Right. And were there games at that time, or when did the games come about?
There were games. I don't know when the first game was, but they've been around a long time. And there were Met camps,
palm readers,
and tarot card readers, and things like that. Uh, the big midways probably carried 10 or 12 of these shows and a couple of rides. And that was a big show. I have a photograph of a midway from the great Parker shows from around that area. Of course, we all know that Parker made merry-go-rounds and made show fronts, and but they had their own carnivals out too. In fact, they got a lot of these early carnival owners started in the business because they would lease the show out. Maybe not the route, but the whole show. So if you wanted to get involved in the carnival business, you went and saw Parker, and he'd put you in a show.
Huh. And these routes would consist of how many spots? Like, what was their season look like? And would they go to the same places year after year, or?
Well, they would try, especially if the spot was worth playing. The early spots were just getting started. I'll understand that when I say spots, a lot of people identify spots with fairs, and the county fairs were not the first target of these carnivals. They were playing street fairs because they could play street fairs for a whole lot less money. And a lot of the street fairs were being promoted by, the Masonic lodges and the Knights of Pythias and the Moose Lodge, organizations like that, because all these fraternal organizations were just expanding their organizations, and most of them were comprised of store owners from downtown. People that owned restaurants and hardware stores and general stores, and so they wanted to keep that money just as close as they could, and by promoting them, they also raised money for their fraternal organizations. And the county fairs were being operated by promoters, and the promoters were really sketchy at the time. They would go in and convince the fair board that they and they alone were the only ones capable of organizing a carnival, and usually they got as much money as they could and then blew. So a lot of times.
When did the county fairs or state fairs and the carnival, what we call the midway, sort of intersect? When did that start?
Well, there had always been county fairs and state fairs. The big state fairs were the best organized, but a lot of them didn't have carnivals because there were no carnivals around.
Right.
More or less, grandma would come in with her baking, and somebody come in with their sheep, and just the way you would imagine a county fair to be without the rides. There was always food in there. Somebody would have a restaurant type cookhouse. Usually it was a local affair, and that still is happening. But an actual organized fair with a carnival, of course, didn't happen until, I'm going to tell you, the early 1900s.
Early 1900s.
Yeah, early 1900s.
Because now it's a given that a fair is going to have a carnival and a carnival midway. But I was, as you were explaining before about most of the carnivals would just be set up in a town or do the thing on their own. I was curious when that intersection sort of began, when the midway or a carnival started to provide it for the fairs. That's interesting.
Fairs, the street fairs, which I was explaining, were always the more lucrative, because a lot of times the promoters would pay the carnival to come in. So the carnival kept what they won, and the street fair promoters would put their own things in on the midway. They'd have their own little food stands,
right?
Games, and they'd make money off them.
So the carnival would be the draw, and then they just make the money from the ancillary
Right.
things around it.
And it was
That's
great.
really interesting.
It worked out well for both people, both sides. The carnival made money, and the promoters made money.
So you were saying they tried to go back to the same places, but most of these carnivals, that would existed at that time, pre-ride, let's call it, the 1920s. How many years would they do this, and would they go to the same places? Well, how big was their route? How many states were they in? Were they pretty local, or what did it look like?
It just depended, just the way it depends today. We have shows today that we call 40 milers because they don't play anywhere but around 40 miles from their hometown. Others, the big shows, play the northern continent, the United States, Canada, everywhere. Most shows that play today are localized. You don't see many going west of the Mississippi if their area is east of the Mississippi. And you don't see many West Coast shows venturing into the Midwest and the Eastern Seaboard. They just more or less stay in that territory. But now I was on the West Coast shows years ago in the late 60s, early 70s, and we played all the good spots in California, all in Oregon, Washington, Utah, Nevada. We played Idaho, Montana. We had a Canadian route, and then we went and played the Arizona State Fair. That's one unit. That's just one unit. There were probably 3 to 4, more or less. There were 3, sometimes 4, which the fourth one would be a little shopping center unit. But those were the size of the units. But that's how extensive the route was.
There were shows, I know I read in one book, I think it was Johnny J. Jones shows, went from coast to coast, basically.
Yeah, Johnny J. That's like the Royal American. They went all the way up to Canada, had that great Canadian route. And then they would come out of Canada and play state fairs for the remainder of their season. They never really went
west.
West. Yeah, it's a different, to your listeners, and I'm sure they'll all agree with me, West Coast carnivals and East Coast carnivals are 2 different animals. I've been out west, and I love it out there. I just, if the West Coast shows hadn't have gone bankrupt, I'd probably still be on it. I don't know what I'd be doing at 78 years old, but maybe picking up trash on the Midway, but I'd be there. The East Coast carnivals, I've had my greatest life experiences on East Coast carnivals. I just love them, but they're different. There's a great difference, and people.
What is that difference? What makes them different?
It's hard to define. Maybe it's attitude. They're just different operationally, and of course, California. One of the main differences is California has mountains. I know you're going to say, "Well, the East Coast has mountains." Look at the
No, I would.
Well, but trust me when I tell you, California, Oregon, Washington, those are mountains.
Yeah.
When you get into Idaho and Montana, those are mountains. The West Coast people would consider the mountains on the East Coast as foothills. But because of that, the transportation you have to have bigger, more powerful trucks out there. You have to have there are just certain restrictions out there, especially in California, that you don't have on the East Coast, which is one of the reasons I went from California to the East Coast, because for one thing, it was difficult to operate a carnival truck on those freeways out there. It was just so packed, and I didn't like all that, maybe call it closeness of the population. I wanted a little more room to breathe, and so I came out to the East Coast. For a while there, it was great, but now it's about the same on both coasts anymore, especially living here in Florida. Sometimes I can't tell the difference
between these. Yeah, I mean, there's a few shows that still travel pretty far. I mean, Name comes to mind, goes pretty far. RCS goes all the way east to Texas, and sometimes send a few rides out. Wade shows played the New Mexico State Fair, as far west as the New Mexico State Fair for several years, and goes to Oklahoma now. So I guess there's a few that still travel a big distance, still move across the country.
Of course, it was easier. It was easier in the earlier days. When I say earlier, I mean up till the 1950s, because most shows of any size travel by rail.
Right.
Those big rail shows were 50, 60, 70 cars. The Royal American was 93 cars, railroad cars. It's a big train. That train stretched over a mile long. But it was easier to move a show of that size, that distance, when you were moving by rail, because of course you didn't have all the drivers to worry about, which is the main thing. Finding help.
I guess it was all or nothing. Either the train made it or it didn't. Whereas you get 100 trucks, some of them wouldn't make it.
100 drivers, and you're probably more aware than anybody of the disadvantages of procuring help these days. And so if you've got 100 trucks to move, you need 100 drivers. That means they have to all have CDLs.
Right.
That's a wonderful thing, but you're not going to get those CDL drivers, out of Mexico or Venezuela.
Yeah, I had Tommy Coughing on a couple weeks ago on the podcast, and he was telling me when he was younger and Conklin shows first got the A circuit that he had a late truck to go out. I think it was somewhere out west, Winnipeg or someplace like that, and he said that he took the road and he would stop and pick up all the stuff all the trucks had dropped along the way as he went. He said he came with a whole load full of stuff when he got there. So I see what you're saying with that. So by the 1920s, by the time the rides came out, like the Whip you said was the first one, did the rides then come pretty quickly, or were rides really all the rage at that point? Did they come fast, or how long did it take for the rides to kind of take over as far as the attractions on a carnival?
Well, by the 1930s, they were pretty well established. Of course, you had Iley Aircraft, and they came out with their versions of the Octopus and the Rollaplane and the Lupaplane, and then you had Sellner, who came out with the Tilt-A-Roll in 1926, and so he's one. But
the Scrambler.
The Scrambler came along a little later. But
Eli Bridge.
You had individuals like Maine Zillions. You probably never heard of them.
No, I never have.
And they invented some rides. Of course, the Villar brothers invented that big Skywheel, but they also invented 2 or 3 more rides. Everybody was kind of taking a turn at them, and you had a lot of rides that were just one of a kind, and a lot of those one of a kind rides ended up on the Johnny J. Jones show.
Oh yeah,
yeah. They ran for 4 or 5 years on the Johnny J. Jones shows, and then he just disappeared. Nobody knows really whatever happened to them.
Oh no. Yeah, the Valaris build the Seattle wheel that Drew has now. I know they build the space wheels, the double sky wheels.
I don't know if that's the Villar Brothers or not. It probably is. If it's Space Wheels, it's Villar Brothers. Is that what it is?
No, no, it's not a space. They built the space wheels, I know, but I think there are two of them. But I thought that the Seattle wheel was also built by Valari Brothers. I hope to have Jimmy Drew on the podcast soon. I'll ask him.
No, it was. Villar Brothers built. It was built. The space wheel was built for the Seattle World's Fair, and it was designed for the Seattle World's Fair. And Royal American had it. Oh hell, for as long as they were in business.
I could have one of my producers look up a Seattle wheel and see if it was built by the Valari Brothers. I'd be interested to see.
It was.
Yeah, it's an interesting ride. I mean, the Drew Show still puts it up. It looks like, I always think of it something like, it looks like Dr. Seuss would build or something like that. It's an interesting wheel. The space wheels, they kind of made a resurgence not too long ago. A couple people refurbished them and brought them out for a while, but you know, the sky wheel is not as popular a ride as it once was. So that's interesting. What about Alan Herschel too? When did he come around, and what his impact?
Alan Herschel's been around for a while. He originally partnered with Spillman, designing merry-go-rounds, but they also built other rides, kiddie rides especially, and they had what the heck's the name of the ride they had? They built 2 or 3 different models of rides. Doggone, I can't remember now. Age, but you know, they built raceways and things like that. They the people that were instrumental in building the earlier rides, for instance, there was a man named Traver. Have you ever heard of him?
No, haven't.
Well, Traver built and designed 2 or 3 different rides. He's most famously known for designing roller coasters for amusement parks.
Okay.
But he built something called the Tumble Bug. And a lot of the carnivals, even though it's a big, heavy ride, a lot of the carnivals owned a Tumble Bug. The big carnivals, and I want to say big because Johnny J. Jones comes to mind, because Johnny J. Jones he was one of the first big Sunday school shows. You know what I mean by Sunday school show?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no racket on his show. He had an agreement with these ride manufacturers that he would come into these rides before they appeared on anybody else's midway.
Oh.
And all of his fares, maybe not all of them, but most of the fares that he signed, he didn't even have contracts for. He just signed them with a handshake. That's the kind of gentleman that he was, and he was known for being honest and forthright. And so, you know, people just loved doing business with him. And so he had the newest rides. He would have the best of the back end shows. He didn't have nickel and dime operations. I apologize. Lungs. He had only the best, only the brightest and most popular games, back end shows, nothing dishonest on his midway. And for the era that he was operating, that was unique.
When did he operate? What years? From when to when? Do you know?
Yeah, he operated from about 1914 until 1930.
Oh, wow.
When he operated in 1930, of course, the Great Depression had just kicked in. and he died of renal failure in 1930. But he was, unfortunately, he was a heavy drinker, and actually, what killed him was the alcohol. But his wife took the show over and operated it successfully for another 2 or 3 decades.
Oh, wow.
And it was a big, big show.
And so some of these other shows, I don't know when they started exactly, but you hear about Reuben and Cherry and Setlin and Wilson, and of course, Straight Shows has been around forever. Reithofer shows claims a long lineage. I'm not sure when they actually became big, but there's so many big shows that Royal American, of course. I don't know how I forgot them for a second, but what were all those shows like, and how long? What were their? How long did they exist? John Marks is another one I can think of. There's quite a few.
Well, when you say big, it's kind of a relative term.
Yeah.
They were big when shows were small. They were just as small as everybody else, and they graduated into being big as carnivals increased in size. They went along with them. I think. Reuben and Cherry, of course, got bought out. A lot of it ended up over with Royal American. It was sold at auction. A lot of these shows didn't make it to the end of the Great Depression. They tried, and some of them even thrived in the midst of the Great Depression. What happens to these shows is that, my personal opinion anyway, most of these shows are created by 1 or 2 individuals who have the vision and the drive and the tenacity to make the show a success. They put
and the showmanship too, I guess, to a certain extent, right?
Showmanship can be entered into the equation, but they put everything they have into it. Straits is a great example. Started out in the at shows. Wrestler, he was known as Strangler Lewis, and today that show's in 2023 celebrated its 100th year anniversary.
Yep.
But they have a lifespan because those people who start the show initially have a lifespan, and so they last 20, 30 years. Maybe 40 years, and that's a stretch. And then the initial individual that started the show gets old.
Yeah.
Or they get tired. And then they pass the show along to their relatives. Usually it's a son. And the son is unqualified because the son doesn't have the drive that the father had. He's had everything handed to him all his whole life, and so he doesn't have that hunger, that it took to get that show on the road and make it the success that it was.
And Straits is a great example. That guy, I read some old ABs one time, and when the grandfather, I guess now, Straits passed away, and Mr. Straits was, I think, just out of the army or something, or out of the military.
Marine.
Yeah, Marines, right? Excuse me. Oh my gosh, he get mad at me. He's a Marine. When he got out, there was a lot of speculation. Would he be able to hold the show? Would he be able to hold the spots? Would he be able to do it? And of course, we know now that he not only did he do it, but he thrived and did real well. And now, his kids are running it on top of it. But some of those multi-generational shows are interesting. That I interviewed, like I said, Phil Vivona a few weeks ago. So the 5 brothers have now, Phil's still stops by, but he's not really involved in the management. But the cousins are all running it. There's 5 cousins now that run it, and they're doing pretty well with it. Straits, like we said, is 3 generations. Reithofer comes to mind as 2nd and 3rd generations. There's just so many that are, have been able to survive multi-generations.
Yeah, and I can tell you, I know Mr. Straits personally, and he's more than qualified and was more than qualified when he took the show over. He had been a lieutenant in the Marines,
Yep.
and he brought that vision of the new generation to that show. And if it hadn't have been for him, the show would have foundered. For instance, he's the first one to put computers in the office when nobody had computers. Remember, this is the 1960s.
Yeah.
And I was over there at the time that he took over, and everybody thought it was a ludicrous idea. Computers? Well, nobody knew. They didn't even know what computers were, or, how having those computers could be such an advantage for a carnival, because ignorance. They just didn't know. But he was instrumental in bringing that show along and making it the success that it is. But for every one of him, there's 5 that don't make it. Their kids are drug addicts, or they just don't have the right attitude. And we see it all the time. You see it in all walks of life.
It does seem like the East Coast shows have survived. I mean, Degler is sort of an example, although not, directly, but Straits, Amusements of America, Reithofer, a lot of East Coast shows. I can't think of too many examples on the West Coast, though, that have done the same sort of.
No, there are no big shows. Most of the big shows were formed after the big shows that had been around a while. I once again, I harken back to the West Coast shows. It had been owned by 2 Greek individuals, Mike Rikos and Louis Elias, and they had won the show in a card game.
Oh, jeez.
That's why all the trucks.
Was that the prize, or was that the they lost and they had to get the show?
All of the trucks were numbered. The last numbers was 6 and 8, because that's what they'd won. That's the hand they'd won with.
Oh my gosh!
But you take what blanking again? The last railroad show that was out there.
Out west?
Yeah. Foley and Burke.
Foley and Burke, okay.
Foley and Burke been around forever.
Mm-hmm.
And they lasted, up until the late 70s, early 80s?
Interesting. Yeah, there's just so many that are examples. And then you think of some of the smaller ones, or guys that like Floyd Gooding with Gooding shows in Ohio had so many units, wasn't necessarily traveling all over the country, but Ohio, he was the, he had everything basically for a long time. Some of the Chicago guys that play around up there, there's so many carnivals up there that have been around a long time. Windy City Amusements, I guess, is another one that's in the second generation, at least, and into the third generation. But those guys, like you said, stay regional or stay local, as opposed to moving about the country and doing the thing that some shows do.
Well, when you have a show like the West Coast shows, Foley and Burke, those 2 carnivals just by themselves had pretty much every spot worth playing in California. The West Coast shows went to Oregon and Washington, Montana, Idaho. All, they played state fairs. Every show, every spot that was worth playing in those states, one of these carnivals played. So now when they go out of business, that creates a big vacuum.
Big vacuum. I neglected to mention Butler shows is multi-generational. That I should have.
They are, and Butler got his start on the West Coast shows.
Yeah.
It was, I remember when Butler was over there. They had they have over there an umbrella ride and a scrambler. Was that it? Or was that Lopez?
When I first sort of came into the business, and it's only been 20-some years. I remember there was West Coast. There was Davis, RCS, who's still around and still thriving. Butler, B&B was big out there. And at least half or so are the carnivals that were big then are gone. And
Carnival Time,
Carnival time shows, right? Yep.
Yeah, those. Well, people get old and they get tired. Man, this business will take it out of you.
Sam Johnston had a couple of units.
Yes, he did. But you spend 40 years beating your head against the wall on those midways, and trying to solve all the problems that comes along with owning a big carnival. You're pretty well exhausted after 40 years. You're ready to retire.
We've only got a couple of minutes left in our hour. I can't believe it already, but tell us a little bit about the museum, and if you visit, what you could expect to see.
Well, the museum started out when I took it over in 2013. It was mostly piles of stuff on the floor, like a big warehouse. It didn't have any organization. Nobody knew what went where, any of the history of the pieces. But over the years now, we've organized it. And of course, you've been through the museum. So you know that it's organized now in exhibits. Most of the exhibits are self-explanatory. We've developed big posters to explain what everything is and some of the history on it. And, we have 2 big floors, and we're adding to it all the time. In fact, I've got a exhibit I'm working on now. I just finished one, and I'm working on another one that will be an arcade exhibit with some really great old arcade machines. The Lake family is so generous in donating pieces like this. We have 4 or 5 years worth of stuff accumulated that we have in exhibits from the Lake family. I can't say enough about them. They're just great. The exhibit I just got through building explains in detail when the movies came to the carnival, because you may or may not know, but Tom Galen. Movies were being produced during the early part of the 20th century, but they had really no place to show them. A lot of these small towns weren't even wired for electricity yet. And so a lot of times the first movie that people from America ever saw was in the back of an old stuffy carnival tent. And so we explained that to them. One of the first movies that they saw was, of course, the Great Train Robbery from 1904. And they were so amazed by this. When it showed the train in the, you would think it was foolish now, but they showed the train coming around the track head on. Some of the men raced out of the tent, and some of the ladies almost fainted because they thought the train was going to hit them. We have, of course, like I explained, a Connerman Ferris wheel. It still turns just like it did over 100 years ago, a little slower than that. It turned over 100 years ago, but it's turning. And, we have a small kiddie merry-go-round in there. It's all been restored. It's a beautiful merry-go-round. We have all kinds of exhibits showcasing a lot of the things that comprise show business at that time. Minstrel shows, very racially charged by today's standards. In fact, I got some argument from my board of directors when I built that thing. You can't put a minstrel show up there while those people will be inflamed. They'll be enraged. They'll storm out of the museum. So not if it's done properly. They won't. I'm one of those people who believes you can't cherry pick history. And they were a part of our business. Pardon me. And so, garbage call. And so I created this minstrel show exhibit, and everybody who's ever come through there, regardless of their race, has said, wow, what a great exhibit this is. So informative. We didn't even know this kind of stuff existed.
Yeah, the history is amazing. And you're open on the weekends, Saturdays and Sundays?
Noon to 5, every weekend, rain or shine.
Every weekend, rain or shine.
And we have thousands of exhibits.
Yeah, you do. And there's like a little bit of video too upstairs, and maybe we can record a podcast there next year during the trade show, which will be interesting.
Well, one of the projects that we're working on right now is a documentary showcasing the history of the carnival business. It's a work in progress, and I can tell you, I'm not Cecil B. DeMills.
Well, you have to come back and update us on that as that progresses, because we'd be real interested to hear about it. But I appreciate all the. I mean, I think we only touched on the history. I appreciate everything you got given us, and hopefully you'll come back soon and update us with things that are new.
Okay, I make a point of it if I can.
Thank you so much, Doc. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
And hello to all the audience out there.
This podcast is brought to you by Innovative Ticketing is the ticketing source made for the amusement industry. Our staff of professionals can guide you through your setup, assist with customer service, even on the weekends when you most need it, and help increase your sales through promotions that work. Innovative Ticketing is the ticketing source made for the amusement industry. Sign up today at innovativeticketing.com.